7 years have been erased from your life, but you don't remember a single second of that time. You don't know where you were, what was done to you, or why you were left alone. This is not just a story about disappearance. It is a story about a return that raised even more questions than the disappearance itself. 5 people entered the forests of the Pacific Northwest. 7 years later, one of them emerged onto the highway, an empty vessel, a man with no name and no past. What happened to him and the fate of the other 4 is a mystery that makes the blood run cold. And the most terrifying thing about this story is the silence of the forest and the silence of the sole survivor. It all began in 2017. 5 young people, volunteers and amateur explorers, came together with one goal: to find a lost Native American ceremonial site in the impenetrable forests of the Olympic Peninsula in northwestern Washington state. This place is one of the wildest and least explored on the continent. Dense forests, swamps, no roads, and complete isolation from civilization. For them, it was a challenge, the adventure of a lifetime. The group was led by Marcus, a former Marine in his mid-30s. He was an experienced outdoorsman and was responsible for logistics and safety. With him was Sarah, a medic by training, a woman who had thought through the first aid kit down to the smallest detail. From snake bite remedies to hypothermia treatments, Jake was the tech expert of the group. He had all the gadgets: GPS trackers, satellite phones, cameras, drones. Emma was an anthropologist, and she was the one who came up with the idea of finding this nameless sacred site, which was only known through legends among the local tribes. And the 5th was Tyler. He was a documentary filmmaker, and his job was to film the entire journey. It was through his eyes that we were supposed to see their triumph. They prepared for almost a year. They studied maps, bought the best equipment, and consulted with experts. They had everything: water purification tablets, 3 weeks' worth of food, signal flares, and a satellite phone with several sets of batteries. They weren't naive tourists. They were a well-prepared expedition. The plan was simple: get to the last ranger station in a rented SUV, and from there hike about 40 miles through the forest, navigating with topographic maps and satellite images. The estimated travel time was about a week each way. They promised to check in every 2 days. The first 3 days went according to plan. They sent several short messages: "Everything's fine. We're on schedule. The forest is incredible." They attached a couple of photos: smiling, sweaty faces against a green wall of Douglas firs and cedar trees. The last message from Jake was received on the 3rd day. "Signal is getting very weak. We're entering a deep valley area. Next communication session when we reach higher ground in 2 or 3 days. Don't worry." That was the last anyone heard from them. 3 days passed, then 4. A week. Families began to sound the alarm. At first they tried to calm them down. The forest, poor communication. Surely they just couldn't find a signal. But when the 2nd week passed, it became clear that something was wrong. A search operation began. The Washington state authorities deployed search and rescue teams who were joined by volunteers from the missing hikers' home states. But the Olympic Peninsula is a green hell. From above, from a helicopter, nothing can be seen except a continuous carpet of treetops several 100 feet high. Combing through the forest on foot was like looking for a needle in a haystack the size of Rhode Island. Every step was a struggle, and they had to cut their way through with machetes. The cold, the dampness, the fog, mosquitoes and bears. 12 days after the search began, one of the group stumbled upon their last camp. It was located about 12 miles from the point where the last message was sent. The discovery was both hopeful and terrifying. The tents were still standing, neatly arranged. Nearby was a cold campfire. Scattered dishes lay on the ground, several metal bowls and cups. Sleeping bags were inside the tents, but they were empty. Personal belongings were still there: Clothes, books, hygiene items. It looked as if the people had simply gotten up and left, planning to return in 5 minutes. But that wasn't the strangest thing. The strangest thing was what wasn't there. There were no signs of a struggle. There was no blood. There were no signs of an attack by wild animals, no torn pieces of fabric, no claw marks, all the most valuable and essential items for survival, backpacks, satellite phones, GPS navigators, bear spray, a first aid kit, and almost all of their food supplies were gone. They disappeared along with the 5 people. Investigators and rescuers were at a dead end. Various theories were put forward. The first and most obvious was that they had gotten lost. But Marcus was too experienced to make such a mistake. Besides, they would not have abandoned the camp with all their equipment. The second was an attack. But by whom? There were no militia groups in these forests. The local tribes that were occasionally encountered in these parts were peaceful and avoided strangers. An attack by drug runners or smugglers, perhaps, but they would have left traces. And why would they take 5 hikers captive? That would cause too much trouble. Animals? A large predator such as a bear or cougar would have left a completely different picture. The search continued for another month. Helicopters circled over the forest. Rescuers combed dozens of square miles to no avail. The 5 explorers seemed to have vanished into thin air. In the end, the active search was called off. The case was officially declared an accident. The 5 hikers were declared missing, and over time presumed dead. Their families mourned their loved ones, and the world slowly forgot about the story. The forests of the Olympic Peninsula kept their secret. A year passed, then 2, then 5. It seemed that this story would remain an unsolved mystery. And then, in 2024, 7 years later, the unthinkable happened. On a busy interstate highway a few dozen miles from Seattle, Washington, the state police picked up a strange man. He was walking barefoot along the shoulder of the road, dressed in rags that had once been clothes. He was emaciated, skin and bones covered in dirt and old, long-healed scars. His face was overgrown with a thick beard, his hair matted into a single mass. He did not react to people. His gaze was empty and detached. He could not say a word, not a single sound. He just stared silently at one spot. Of course, he had no identification on him. The police took him to the nearest hospital, thinking he was just another homeless person or mentally ill individual. He was placed in a ward and began treatment for exhaustion and dehydration. No one knew who he was or where he came from. He was just a nameless patient, another tragic fate on the streets of a big city. But one of the doctors, a young resident who was fascinated by unsolved cases, happened to see a photo of the man in a police report. Something in his features, even under the layer of dirt and beard, seemed vaguely familiar to him. He began digging through the archives, looking through cases of missing persons from the last 10 years, and he found it. It was a photo of Tyler, a young, smiling documentary filmmaker from an expedition in 2017. The resemblance was striking. To confirm his hunch, a DNA test was needed. Samples were sent to a national database. The answer came back a few weeks later and shocked everyone. It was a 100% match. The silent and broken man found on the highway was Tyler, one of the 5 hikers who disappeared in the forests of the Olympic Peninsula 7 years ago. He was back, but his return brought no answers. It only brought new, even deeper horror. Where had he been all these years? What had happened to the others? And why is he silent? A medical examination provided the first frightening clues. His body was a map of his suffering. Multiple old scars covered his back, arms, and legs. Doctors determined that the scars had been left by a blunt but hard object, possibly a stick or a whip made of vines. Some of the wounds were very old, others relatively recent. Characteristic ring-shaped scars were found on his ankles and wrists, as if he had been kept in shackles or tied with ropes for a long time. His joints, especially his knees and ankles, were worn down to a state typical of very elderly people. This suggested that he had either walked a lot and for a long time over rough terrain, or had been forced to perform some kind of exhausting physical labor. Tests showed no traces of modern food, drugs, or chemicals in his body. His diet had consisted of plant-based foods and possibly raw meat for a long time. He had not brushed his teeth in 7 years. There were no traces of soap, shampoo, or any other modern products on his skin or in his hair. He was completely cut off from civilization. But the most frightening thing was his mental state. He was diagnosed with severe dissociative amnesia. He didn't just not remember what had happened to him. He didn't remember who he was. He didn't recognize himself in the mirror. He didn't respond to his name. He didn't understand speech in any language. All attempts by psychologists to establish contact with him failed. He sat on the bed in his ward, rocking back and forth, and remained silent. His gaze was completely empty. Sometimes at night, the nurses heard him making strange guttural sounds that sounded more like the clicks or cries of some forest bird than human speech. When he was shown photographs of his family and friends from the missing expedition, he looked at them without expression, as if seeing them for the first time. He was a living ghost, a shell of a man, stripped of his personality and memory. The investigation was resumed with renewed vigor. Tyler was their only lead, their only witness, but he was mute. So the investigators began to study not his words, but his body and behavior, trying to piece together a picture of what might have happened in the forest 7 years ago. The investigators and doctors were faced with an unprecedented task. They had the only living witness who had seen everything, but his mind was locked behind 7 seals. Tyler became the subject of round-the-clock surveillance. Every gesture, every glance, every sound was analyzed in the hope of finding a key to the mystery. His behavior in the hospital ward was that of a wild animal caught in a cage. He was afraid of enclosed spaces, but he was even more frightened by the open sky he could see from the window. He didn't sleep at night, but dozed fitfully for 15 to 20 minutes at a time, sitting in a corner and listening to every sound. Any sudden noise, a door creaking, an object falling, made him cringe. At the same time, he was completely unresponsive to the sounds of civilization. The hum of cars outside the window, sirens, and the television were just background noise to him. His attitude toward food was peculiar. At first, he refused to eat the hospital food, but when the nurse left the tray and returned a few minutes later, she found that all the food had disappeared. Later, through surveillance cameras, they saw him feverishly looking around and shoving food into his mouth, hiding what he couldn't eat under the mattress, behind the radiator, and in the bedside table drawer. It was the instinct of a man who had been starving for a long time and did not know when he would be able to eat again. The psychologists who tried to work with him quickly reached a dead end. Talk therapy was useless. They moved on to other methods, including art therapy and music. They gave him paper, pencils, and clay. For several weeks, he ignored these items. One day, he picked up a piece of charcoal that had been used for drawing and began to draw with it on a sheet of paper. At first, they were just chaotic lines, scribbles, but gradually, day after day, a pattern began to emerge from these lines. He drew the same thing over and over again. It was not a drawing in the usual sense. It was a map, primitive, childish, but definitely a map. It depicted a river that split in two, a mountain with a distinctive sloping peak and a cluster of dots that resembled a group of trees or rocks. In the center of the map, he always drew a cross. The investigators took this very seriously. They pulled up all the satellite images of the Olympic Peninsula. It was a titanic task, matching a rough child's drawing with thousands of square miles of real terrain. Analysts spent several weeks working with the maps, superimposing Tyler's drawing on different areas of the forest. And they found it. They found a match in one of the most remote and inaccessible areas which the first search party had not reached. The terrain exactly matched Tyler's drawing. There was the same river with a fork, the same mountain with a recognizable ridge. This area was an isolated valley surrounded by almost sheer cliffs. It could only be reached by rappelling down the cliff face or through a single narrow crevice littered with rocks and overgrown with undergrowth. During the first search operation, this area had been marked as impassable and bypassed. Now they had a specific goal. But what did the cross in the center of the map mean? The place where he had been held captive, or the place where his friends were buried? Another group of experts was working in parallel. Linguists and anthropologists recorded the strange, guttural sounds Tyler made at night. They analyzed dozens of hours of recordings and concluded that these were not meaningless sounds. There was a specific structure, repetition, and rhythm to them. It was some form of communication, but not human language. The experts suggested that it was either an imitation of animal sounds that he used to communicate with someone or a primitive language that he had been taught. They began playing him recordings of various natural sounds. The reactions were striking. The sound of rain or wind calmed him, but the sounds of some animals caused him to panic. He reacted particularly strongly to the cry of a rare spotted owl that lives only in the old-growth forests of the Pacific Northwest. Upon hearing this recording, Tyler cowered in a corner, covered his head with his hands, and began to rock back and forth, making a quiet whimpering sound. It was genuine animal terror. A botanist was called in to investigate further. He carefully examined the rags Tyler was wearing, as well as samples taken from his hair and under his fingernails. Under a microscope, he discovered spores of a rare species of moss and pollen from a flower that only grows under specific conditions on limestone cliffs at an altitude of more than 1,500 feet above sea level. And that was another perfect match. Both the spotted owl and this moss were found in the very isolated valley indicated on Tyler's map. Now, the investigation had 3 independent pieces of evidence that led to the same conclusion. A map drawn from the depths of the subconscious, a panic reaction to the cry of a bird native to a specific region, and microscopic plant particles that could only have gotten on his clothes there. There was no doubt. Everything that happened to Tyler and his friends happened in this valley. It was decided to prepare a new expedition. This time, it was not a rescue mission, but rather a law enforcement operation. The group included Washington State Police tactical officers, a detective, a medical examiner, and a guide from a local Native American tribe who knew the area better than anyone else. Their task was not just to find traces of the missing, but to be prepared to encounter anyone or anything. No one knew what awaited them in this valley. Were the other members of the group still alive? If so, what condition were they in? If they had been taken captive, who were their captors? An isolated individual who had never had contact with civilization. Criminals who had set up a base in the mountains, or something else that defied rational explanation. There were more questions than answers. Tyler was also being prepared for the expedition, but not as a participant, but as a detector. The investigators decided that his presence nearby, even in the safety of the base camp, might trigger new memories or reactions that would help on site. His condition stabilized somewhat. He began to eat from his plate and stopped hiding food. He still did not speak or show any signs of recognition, but he became calmer. However, when he was shown a map of the area where the group was going and the valley was pointed out to him, his behavior changed dramatically. He began to breathe heavily, his eyes filled with terror. He moved away from the table, jumped up, and began banging his head against the wall, making that same guttural clicking sound. The doctors had to give him a strong sedative. It was the strongest reaction he had had during his entire stay in the hospital. He didn't remember, but his body, his instincts, remembered everything. They remembered the horror that awaited them in that valley. A few days later, the group flew by helicopter to the foothills of the Olympic Mountains early in the morning. The vehicles could go no further. They had several days of strenuous hiking ahead of them to reach the very crevice that was the only entrance to the valley. The weather was deteriorating, and heavy clouds were gathering in the sky. The forest greeted them with a wall of humid, cold air and a deafening chorus of invisible creatures. Every tactical officer was armed and ready for action. They walked in complete silence, communicating only with gestures. They did not know what they would find there beyond the rocks. However, they knew for certain that they were entering a territory where the laws of civilization did not apply, a place from which no one had returned 7 years ago, almost no one. Their goal was a cross on a map drawn by a man who had lost his name. And they were determined to get to the bottom of the truth, no matter how terrible it might be. The expedition entered the gorge, and the world changed. The deafening noise of the forest to which they had become accustomed over the past few days subsided. Here in the valley, there was an almost complete oppressive silence, broken only by the rustling of the wind in the crowns of unfamiliar trees and the distant sound of water. The air was still and heavy. The local guide, who had been walking confidently before now, looked around constantly, his face expressing deep unease. He told the group leader that the elders of his tribe had always forbidden them to enter this valley, calling it the place where the spirits are silent. The group moved forward slowly and cautiously, keeping their weapons at the ready. Soon they came to the river, the very one with the fork in Tyler's drawing. The water was dark and stagnant. Following the riverbed, they began to notice strange signs. There were notches in the tree trunks that did not look like hunters' marks. Between the trees were traps made of branches and sharpened stakes, primitive but deadly. It was clear that someone lived or had lived here, someone who did not want uninvited guests. After several hours of walking, they came out into a clearing. What they saw made them freeze. In the middle of the clearing stood several dilapidated shelters built of branches, mud, and bark. In the center was a long, cold fire pit. The settlement looked abandoned. The tactical team commander gave the signal, and the officers spread out, beginning to examine the structures. In one of the shelters, they found the first piece of irrefutable evidence. Leaning against the wall was the lid of a plastic food container, precisely the same as those used by the missing expedition. In another shelter, a piece of bright blue nylon fabric from a backpack had been used as a patch on a leaky roof. A metal spoon lay nearby, bent and blackened. These were Tyler's group's belongings. They had been here, but where were the people themselves? After searching all the shelters, they found no bodies or any other traces. Then the detective looked again at the map Tyler had drawn. The cross. It was not drawn at the site of the settlement, but slightly to the side at the foot of a cliff. The group headed there, and they found the place. There were 4 small mounds laid out in a circle with river stones, 4 graves. After giving the order to exhume the bodies, the detective felt a chill rise in his throat. They worked in silence. In the first grave, not very deep, they found human remains. Next to the bones lay a compass, an old brass compass on a leather strap, which Marcus, the group leader, always carried with him. In the second grave, they found remains and a small silver pendant in the shape of a crescent moon, a gift from Emma's father before she left. The third and fourth graves also contained personal belongings that allowed them to identify Sarah and Jake without a doubt. All 4 were here. Their long journey had ended in this nameless valley. The medical examiner, who was part of the team, conducted a preliminary examination of the remains. He found no signs of violent death in the usual sense, no gunshot wounds or fractures from blows. But the condition of the bones told a different story. A terrible slow death, extreme malnutrition, signs of scurvy and other diseases caused by vitamin deficiency. They weren't killed. They died a slow, painful death over several years. But who buried them? And what happened to Tyler? Why did he survive? At that moment, the guide, who had been standing aside all this time, called the commander over. He pointed to the rock, on the smooth surface of the stone, just above human height. There were faint scratches. They led to the side, to the thick undergrowth at the very foot of the mountain. They did not appear to be natural cracks. They were signs left by humans. Following them, the group discovered a narrow entrance to a cave, almost invisible behind a curtain of vegetation. The darkness was damp and smelled of old smoke and decay. The tactical officers turned on the flashlights on their weapons and entered the cave. The cave was shallow but clearly inhabited. In the corner lay a pile of old animal skins and dry leaves. A bed. The walls were scratched with the same strange symbols as those on the trees outside. And in the farthest, darkest corner of the cave sat he, a man, an older man, wizened with long grey hair and a beard, dressed in animal skins. He sat crouched, his arms wrapped around his knees, and stared at the light of the flashlights without fear, but with a kind of animal curiosity. When one of the officers shouted a command at him in English, he did not respond. He just stared. And then he made a sound, a soft, guttural click, exactly like the one Tyler had made in the hospital ward. Everything fell into place. This older man was not a member of some isolated tribe. Judging by his features, he was Caucasian. Perhaps he was a former veteran from the Vietnam era who had fled to the wilderness decades ago to escape his demons and had lost his mind over the years, turning into a hermit. He was the sole master of this valley, and then one day 5 strangers invaded his world. Tyler's group had probably gotten lost. Their equipment had broken down, and they had stumbled upon this valley exhausted. They were too weak to fight back. And the older man, he wasn't a murderer in the true sense of the word. He was a madman who had lived in complete solitude for 30 or 40 years. For him, these 5 were not victims, but rather companions, his own little tribe. He didn't know how to treat people. He kept them with him like animals. He fed them what he ate himself: roots, raw meat, insects. He taught them his language of clicks and bird cries. He punished them for disobedience as one punishes a disobedient animal. Hence the scars on Tyler's body. 4 of them could not endure such a life. Their bodies, accustomed to civilization, could not cope with disease and the primitive diet. They died one after another, and the older man buried them as best he could. Tyler survived simply because he was the youngest and physically strongest. He spent 7 years in this hell. He unlearned how to be human and learned to be a creature living in a cave. His escape was most likely an accident. Perhaps the older man fell ill and grew weak, or possibly Tyler, following some instinct, left the valley and walked until, by sheer luck, he came upon a highway. The older man was led out of the cave. He did not resist. He was taken to Seattle. It was impossible to put him on trial. He was declared mentally incompetent, a man whose mind had been destroyed by decades of absolute isolation. He was placed in a secure psychiatric facility. The case of the expedition's disappearance was officially closed. The remains of the 4 hikers were returned to their families. And Tyler never spoke again. His memory never returned. He spent the rest of his days in a specialized care facility. He was calm and obedient, but his eyes always remained empty. Sometimes sitting by the window and looking at the trees, he would make quiet, guttural clicks. He was home, safe among people. But part of his soul remained there in the valley where the spirits are silent, in a place that erased his name and his past, leaving behind only a living shell full of quiet horror.